Even after 2,000 years, a mythical Celtic world still grips the popular imagination. But I think very few people understand who the Celts actually were or what their legacy truly is. If you ask most people, they'd probably say the Celts lived in Ireland, Scotland and Wales. Their descendants are the kind of people you might spot at traditional Highland games in Scotland. Some people have no doubts about being a Celt. Are you a Celt?
Yes.
Simple answer.
Yes, definitely.
I just see myself as a Scotsman.
Any nation that had a strong clan set up, I mean, I think that's where you find the Celts.
Clan is a Gaelic word for children. Here in Scotland, it means a tribal family.
You know, and I think a Scot and a Celt are very similar things. Although I think there's Celts in Wales and Ireland as well, isn't there?
I can't speak for what is a Celt, but I can speak for there's a lot of pride in Wales. That's why we're in the St David's kilt, and we're proud of our language, you know. And I mean, when you gofalu about popeth yn y dyfodol, we're going to look after everything in the future.
So a Celt is someone living on the fringes of the British Isles, who has red hair, wears a tartan kilt, and speaks a Celtic language like Welsh or Gaelic. But then these people also believe they're upholding Celtic tradition. Not a Scottish or a Welsh one, but a British one. There's not a kilt or caber in sight as these modern-day Druids celebrate the autumn equinox.
I feel that Celtic is a culture that was absorbed by the people of this land during the Iron Age. And the Druids were really part of that culture.
Bounty of the boundless heavens.
Here, our Celtic heritage is thought to be pagan, British and essentially spiritual.
People see it as poetic, artistic, having an awareness that certain parts of the landscape held certain spirits, certain deities, the spirits of waterfalls and springs and streams, for instance. I think this really captures people's imagination.
These modern-day Druids believe they are connecting with a mystical Celtic past and the pagan spirits of the earth.
Spirits of the West, to which our ancestors used to sacrifice in the streams, the rivers, the lakes, and in the bogs where the water meets the earth. Hail and welcome.
Hail and welcome.
But hang on, before we buy into this idea of the Celts as simply pagan, let's not overlook the X factor. In Ireland, possibly the place we most associate with the Celts, there's a whole other Celtic legacy, not pagan, but Christian. And if there's one thing that really shouts Celtic, it's a priceless treasure locked away in Trinity College, Dublin.
So it's very much a Georgian building. Now the first floor there is called the Long Room, and it houses one of the most beautiful and indeed valuable artefacts from the early Christian period. It's known as the Book of Kells. Now the Book of Kells is basically a transcription of the four Gospels, but it's decorated in a very ornate, high Celtic style.
Made by Irish monks in the 9th century, the Book of Kells can still stagger us with its beauty. Its swirling patterns and intricate knotwork define the very look we recognise today as Celtic art. A style now so familiar that it's a Celtic cliché, seen on tea towels and jewellery across the world. And here in Ireland, there's another cliché, that there's a special kind of character that's uniquely Celtic. It's all about hospitality, drinking, music, and the gift of the gab. It seems to me that people can claim a Celtic link to confirm all kinds of things. A passionate national identity, a romantic pagan past, even a deep Christian spirituality. But what does any of this have to do with the ancient Celts? I want to reveal the true story of the Celts and discover why their world still evokes such passion today. My quest starts here in the Long Room in Trinity College, Dublin. Its library walls are stacked with manuscripts and translations of ancient Roman and Greek texts. They were copied by hand by the same monks who created the Book of Kells. In these books are my first clues to the origins of the ancient Celtic world.
I've just found this book written by the Greek historian Herodotus, the so-called father of history, and has a very interesting passage. That river flows from the land of the Keltoi and the city of Purene through the very midst of Europe. Now the Keltoi dwell beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Now this is one of the very first mentions of the word Celt in history. But Herodotus was also called the father of lies, because not everything he said was true. So I need to go to Europe to look for the archaeological evidence of these ancient peoples we call the Celts.
The word Celt was first used by the Greeks 2,500 years ago. The people they wrote about didn't live in the British Isles, but at the head of the River Danube in Germany. To uncover the secret history of the Celtic world, I'm embarking on an epic 4,000-mile journey. I'm travelling in the footsteps of the ancient Celts across the heart of Europe. The Celts had no written language, so we only know what the Greeks and Romans said about them. They said they were primitive and barbaric. They were headhunters with a passion for heavy drinking and savage religious practices like human sacrifice. This couldn't be further from today's romantic picture of the Celts. I'm going to have to separate fact from fantasy. But my journey to find them doesn't start in Wales or Ireland, but in Germany. I have to go back 2,500 years to a time when the Celts were masters of Europe. The Romans described the Celts as warlike and barbaric, but it was the Greeks that first wrote about them in the 6th century BC. They wrote of a people called the Keltoi, who lived in a place called Purena on the upper reaches of the River Danube. I've come here to the heart of Germany, to a place where archaeologists have spent 20 years uncovering the site of a massive Iron Age hill fort. It's called the Heuneberg, and it was occupied in the 6th century BC, the same period as the world of classical Greece. The Heuneberg doesn't look like the home of a barbarian tribe. It's a huge walled settlement. This reconstruction is only a fraction of the original, but it is in exactly the right place to be Purena.
So do you think this is the town that the Greeks mentioned, the first Celtic town in history?
Yeah, I think so. That this is this town Purene mentioned by Herodot, and he talked about a town in the land of the Celts in the region of the Upper Danube, and I think that this is the Heuneberg.
Heuneberg's location isn't the only evidence. The unique way these original walls were made shows that the people here were in touch with the Greeks.
The construction of the wall is really a Greek wall. We don't know if it was the Celts who built up the wall or if they had Greek craftsmen who did the work and also the planning and the construction.
So you're saying that the Celts basically copied the Greek way of building here?
Yes, they copied, or maybe they had Greek craftsmen who built up the wall here in this place.
So it's in the right place, may have been built by the Greeks, so it's very good evidence that, in fact, this is the place.
Yeah, this is Purene.
It was farming that created the wealth to import luxury goods from Greece into these early Celtic chiefdoms. There's no evidence of war at Heuneberg. The massive walls weren't for defence. They were painted white and would have been visible from miles away. They were a status symbol.
So 2,500 years old and it's still standing?
Yes.
As more of the site is uncovered, there is mounting evidence of trade with the Greek world.
What makes you think that this is the place that Herodotus mentions in his book?
Because it's an important hill fort And also we have Greek findings here. We have Greek ceramics and Greek wine amphoras, which were imported here in this, at this site. Here we have Greek ceramics. It was imported directly from Athens.
Classical Greece was a wealthy consumer society, and the barbarian north was rich in raw materials.
We also have proofs for textile production here in the settlement. We found a lot of these artifacts.
It's used in spinning.
Yes.
In exchange for textiles and manufactured items, these Celts imported luxury goods from Greece, and there was nothing more important to them than wine.
Then we have jewelry, for example, a bronze bracelet.
Okay.
And these artifacts were fabricated here at the site.
Far from being home to barbarians, this ancient Celtic town was a hive of industrial activity, weaving textiles, firing ceramics, and casting high-quality metalwork. So why did they choose this particular location?
I think it's the situation near the river Danube. And the river Danube is an important trading line through Europe.
So the Celts were middlemen. So that was the prehistoric autobahn, really?
Yes.
The Danube River?
Yes.
The word Celt was first used by the Greeks to describe many of the northern barbarian tribes. It is unlikely that most of them called themselves that. The name Celts was used in the same way as the word Indian was used to describe all the native tribes of North America. So what kind of people were they? To find out, I have come to the most spectacular burial of this early Celtic period. In 1978, a remarkable discovery was made beneath a field 100 miles to the north of Hoineberg, on the outskirts of a town called Hochdorf. This is the Hochdorf Prince. I'm now face to face with my first ancient Celt, but this is not a warrior's grave. The only weapon here is a small iron dagger decorated with gold. This Celtic prince is laid out in luxury on a Greek-style bronze couch covered with furs and fabrics. Round his neck is a golden torque, and on his head he wore a strange conical hat made of birch bark. All about him lay the trappings of immense wealth and power. A four-wheeled decorated wagon was laden with feasting and drinking equipment. And in one corner stood an enormous Greek cauldron that could hold 70 gallons of wine. This prince took his entertaining very seriously indeed. This spectacular array of goods and equipment gives us a unique portrait of the life of an ancient Celtic prince.
The deceased chief was laid on this chariot and was carried into his tomb. And this iron masterpiece is really unique. They were really very, very elaborate in blacksmith working.
What can this breathtaking grave tell us about the early Celtic world in Central Europe?
Well, it tells us that he had international contacts, that he was part of these cultures around the Mediterranean world, that they could exchange ideas, that they could exchange goods. And all you can see here, his signs of power as a chief of this tribe in Hochdorf.
So it's really like a throne, except you lie down on it instead of sit on it.
It's a huge bronze throne, or a throne where you lay on, as the Greeks did in this time.
My first Celt isn't a headhunting warrior at all. He's a cultured diplomat, in touch with the most advanced people of the ancient world, the Greeks. He traded in Greek goods, and probably Greek ideas too. So what was it that made people like the prince rich?
It was the new Iron Age. It was the iron itself. They were mining the iron, and with the iron started a totally new dimension in trading.
So the Greeks?
With the Greeks. So we can really say this is the beginning of the Celtic world in Central Europe.
So I found the first Celts the city of Purena and a Celtic prince, but neither match classical descriptions of barbaric Celts, nor do they seem to have much in common with our present-day notions of Celticness, except that the Hochdorf prince was clearly a bit of a drinker. Archaeology reveals that 50 years after the death of the Hochdorf prince, the old Celtic settlements of central Germany suddenly vanished. Something had changed. A new Celtic society was emerging, and power shifted to the west. To find the evidence, I have to head to the most famous Celtic site in Europe. I'm here on the shores of Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland. Today it's a simple holiday resort, but more than 2,000 years ago, it was a site of ritual offering and sacrifice. And it was to coin the international brand name of the Celtic world, a name synonymous with both beauty and with violence. This is La Tène. In the 5th century, the waterfront at La Tène was neither cemetery nor settlement. It was a sacred religious site. For the ancient Celts, water was the gateway between this world and the next. It was here they offered tribute with their most precious possessions. In 1857, a Swiss archaeologist stumbled on a huge hoard of Celtic offerings preserved in the muddy floor of the lake bed. Now stored in this vault, it is a snapshot of a new Celtic world at the peak of its power. This is a pretty big drawer. You must have some treasure in it.
Of course. The treasure of the past.
More than 2,500 objects were recovered. They would make the name La Tène forever associated with the Celtic world.
So this is all from La Tène?
Yes, it's all from the site of La Tène. Hundreds of pieces of iron and tools in wood.
So is this a typical La Tène shield?
Yes, it's typical La Tène shield.
Can I hold this?
Yes, take it good in the hand. Voila.
So it's amazing to think that we can actually hold this today.
What is astonishing for the pieces of La Tène, that they were not broken or destroyed. And,
so the sword's still in its scabbard.
Yes, and it looked like as new.
The most striking feature of this new Celtic culture was the amount of weaponry, finely decorated with a distinctive art style.
But the decoration here is very, very, very fine.
The decoration's all these
here,
swirling lines.
It's coming here.
Is this the typical La Tène style?
Yes, of course, this is it.
Curving lines. The finds at La Tène mark the beginning of the swirling patterns that we have now come to recognize as distinctively Celtic. The magical and symbolic reworking of animal, plant and spiral designs would define the international Celtic look for centuries. It's astonishing that a society without writing was able to produce such geometrically complex works of art. But from the lake bed at La Tène came other, more grisly finds. Among the swords and shields was found evidence of human sacrifice.
We have found a series of skulls, and the question, are these people dead by an accident or killed by sacrifice? We have found one with a rope on the site of La Tène in the 19th century.
So you know that people were sacrificed or at least executed?
Probably they have had some problems.
Some problems, that's a big problem. Human sacrifice and ritual offerings went hand in hand with this new warrior culture. I'm now beginning to recognize these Celts, or Gauls as they were called by the Romans. They were warrior tribes, highly ambitious and mobile, and Europe was ripe for a takeover. Archaeology shows that by the 4th century BC, La Tène Celtic culture had spread rapidly from Central Europe into the Balkans and Italy, and westward to Spain and France. I want a taste of this warrior culture, so I've come to meet a group of German archaeologists whose mission it is to bring the Celtic world to life as authentically as possible.
So here's a chainmail. Right, thanks.
Is the old member of the team?
Yeah.
The first thing I must do is to dress the part of an authentic Celtic warrior.
And what's the choice?
Chalk or chainmail?
Let me have a think.
Before 300 BC, most Celtic warriors preferred to fight naked in battle. Their only defence was body paint, a shield, and trust in their gods.
I think I'll go for this chainmail.
Chainmail, okay.
The most important thing a Celtic warrior had to wear was the torque.
Looks brilliant, eh?
It's the sure sign of a Celtic nobleman.
Yeah, looks fine.
It's a bit ostentatious.
The Romans described the Celts as superstitious, and the wearing of the torque may have had a religious significance. After centuries of fighting, war was a cultural thing for the Celts, but it was also an income. Celtic warriors had such a reputation that they were in high demand as mercenaries.
The main weapon for the Celts was the lance. It was a really lethal weapon. You see, it's quite sharp. The most important defense weapon for the Celts is the big shield.
And how strong would it be against a spear?
Yeah, it's a spear doesn't come through. The weapon for the nobleman is a sword, of course. You see?
Celtic warfare was all about drama and display. One of the most terrifying sounds on the battlefield was made by the boar-headed war carnix. Scores of these war trumpets would be sounded to instill fear into the enemy.
Bit of psychological warfare there. Make them all laugh and then kill them. That's as good as it gets.
The Romans described Celtic battle tactics as simple but effective. First, the enemy was taunted.
Imagine 10,000 of Celts doing this. Quite impressive, I think.
Yes.
The bravest warriors would then charge forward. The whole force would then rush the enemy, trying to make them panic and run. And if it didn't work the first time, they'd simply walk back and start all over again. We tend to think of the Celts as underdogs, a people who would easily have been pushed aside by superior Roman technology. But this just wasn't true. Celtic technology was originally more advanced in many ways than that of Greece or Rome. The chainmail I'm wearing was a Celtic invention of the 4th century BC, and use of iron nails would revolutionize Celtic shipbuilding techniques. With their swords, iron-wheeled chariots, and metal horseshoes, the Celts led military campaigns against neighbouring tribes and even against the Greeks and Romans. In 390 BC, Celtic tribes sacked an expanding city-state called Rome. The Romans would steal lots of ideas from the Celts, but there was one Celtic practice that really appalled them: headhunting.
There we are. Take this back to England.
The Romans said that the Celts kept human heads both as trophies and as offerings to their gods. A Celtic shrine just like this one was found in southern France.
So this is a shrine, but it seems a bit shocking to people today that you have skulls as part of your religion. What
Yes,
does it
maybe
mean?
it was a part of a religion. The Celts was headhunters. They go in the war and cut the heads from the enemies, and then they bring it home and they build special houses and they take it inside.
So it's
Maybe.
like trophies?
Yes, like a trophies, yeah.
And now touch this ring and feel the spirit of Celtic way of life.
Thank you.
The early Celts were far more than simple barbarians. They were technically advanced, rich and powerful, and their complex culture stretched from Spain to Turkey. But what I want to find out is, did the Celts deserve their barbaric reputation, or was it Roman propaganda? To find the evidence, I've come to northern France, to the battlefields of the Somme. The landscape here is littered with the bones of thousands of unknown warriors from the First World War. And it was during that conflict that soldiers digging trenches at Ribermont stumbled upon the remains of a much earlier conflict. They found the bones of men aged from 15 to 40 years old, all bearing the marks of violent trauma. They had unearthed the Celtic War Memorial on the site of a battle in which thousands of warriors had fought and many had died. This was no ordinary shrine. And what it reveals gives us a remarkable insight into the Celtic world's attitude towards war and death.
We can say that there were hundreds of warriors killed. More or less 500 died. It was a huge battle.
The battle was fought around 280 BC between two warring Celtic tribes.
The defeated warriors were a Brittany tribe called Armoricans. The victorious warriors were called Ambions, that's to say a Belgian tribe.
In the 3rd century BC, Europe's Celtic tribes were jostling for territory. Despite the culture they shared, they were much more likely to be fighting each other than cooperating. There are hundreds of slain warriors here, both victors and vanquished, but there is something missing. There are no heads, there's not a single skull amongst the thousands of bones. Is this evidence that what the Romans said about beheading was true?
We have in Ribermont found some neck vertebrae which show signs of cutting by a knife, which is evidence of beheading.
At Ribermont, no skulls remain because they were all taken back to the victors' villages as trophies and memorials. What puzzled the archaeologists was not just the beheading, but the curious way the bones were scattered on the ground. A ritual had taken place after the bodies were decapitated.
They were transported from the battlefield and displayed as a Celtic war trophy above the ground for several years.
The headless bodies of the vanquished were hung with their weapons on wooden frames. When they had rotted and fallen to the floor, the bones were crushed and burnt. The bodies of the victors' dead were treated differently. Their bones were neatly stacked together to form an altar.
And we think that this construction represents a kind of shrine built from criss-crossing human bones. Then the ashes from defeated warriors' corpses were placed in the center of the altar in order to honor their gods.
It's little wonder the Romans were horrified by such savage practices. But to the Celts, it all made perfect sense.
I think that the Celts were not savages or barbarians. Quite the opposite, in fact. In fact, Celts were very religious. They treated the remains of their enemy with the same religious respect that they treated their own warriors' corpses.
The discoveries at Ribermont confirm that the Celts placed a spiritual value on the human head. What the Romans thought were savage acts of brutality were actually part of a complex religious system. Archaeology shows that by 200 BC, Gaul had stabilized. The Celtic tribes had put down roots and had begun to build permanent towns. I've come 300 miles south to Courron. This was home to another powerful tribe called the Averni. Excavations here are revealing evidence of a highly complex culture. A society still obsessed with human sacrifice, but now becoming entwined with power and politics. Although it looks like we're going to have a party, I've actually come to Courron to reenact a sacrificial beheading.
It's the best wine we could find. Yeah.
But it won't be a human victim, it will be a wine emperor. So we're doing a bit of experimental archaeology here, going back over 2,000 years, and I'm going to do my first wine sacrifice. Courron was a meeting place for Celtic tribes in Gaul. It was here that diplomatic gifts and favours would be exchanged. Evidence of this lavish hospitality is scattered everywhere.
We've got many amphora pieces, each amphora about 20 liters, and on the whole site we've got thousands of them. How did they get all this wine? What did they exchange for the wine? Ancient text says 1 emperor, 1 slave.
That's quite expensive wine, isn't it?
It's very expensive. That's human life.
The Celts, unlike the Romans and Greeks, drank their wine undiluted.
Greek and Roman traders were horrified by this practice. That's really barbarians that not mix wine with water.
Wine was precious because it symbolized a blood sacrifice. But how exactly do you sacrifice wine?
We can see that smash with a sword.
With a sword?
Emperors were sacrificed.
So they didn't just take the cork out?
No, no. That's a substitute for human sacrifice, because when you decapitate the emperor, the wine comes out like blood, like animal or human blood.
At special feasts, the floor of the sanctuary at Coron was strewn with decapitated amphorae, scattered around sunken pools of wine. As serious drinkers, the Celts brought hospitality to new levels of endurance. But Coron wasn't just for parties. It had a serious function as a place of diplomacy and politics. Here, they even minted their own currency. A wine amphora hasn't been sacrificed on this site for over 2,000 years, until now.
Right here. Okay.
Have a glass of wine. In the Celtic world, nothing is quite what it seems. Headhunting and sacrifice weren't simply evidence of Celtic brutality. They were part of a complex religious world. For the Auvergne tribe, a blood sacrifice would soon become all too real when they chose to oppose the Roman invasion in 58 BC. From the ranks of the Auvergne tribe would come the Celtic world's most tragic leader, Vercingetorix the Gaul. At the start of the 1st century BC, Gaul was becoming increasingly Romanized. Centuries of trading had introduced a way of life not so different from the Roman. Just how sophisticated had Celtic society become? To find out, I've come north to Bibracte. Surrounded by its formidable ramparts, Bibracte was the capital of the Adwi. They were one of the most powerful tribes in Gaul.
Well, Richard, we just entered Bibracte, just passing through one of the 15 gates of this very important town of the 1st century BC.
Bibracte's 5-kilometre defensive wall was a huge engineering achievement, but it was more for show than practical defence.
So, what does this tell us about the Celts?
It tells several different things. Given the scale of this fortification, just 5 kilometers, 15 gates, it's huge. It shows that there was a high level of organization. So that means in this town there was an authority with enough power to force hundreds of thousands of people to build that.
Bibracte was one of the largest and most complex settlements in northern Europe. It had an urban population of thousands and was, to all intents and purposes, a large town.
Just a small selection of the recent discoveries at Bibracte, just to give you an idea of the range. So you see the face of a boar, like the one you can see on the carnix. It's probably a small size carnix.
Oh, it's a spout for pouring wine.
Wine, probably.
What else?
This is a brooch, a bronze brooch. It was used by the women just to fix their dress.
The humble safety pin.
Yes. Another piece, completely different. Pieces of pottery, and the style of decoration is very typical for this region. I think it's typical for the Aedui, who had the capital here. So it's the Aeduan style.
So you're saying the pattern is like a tribal form of identity?
Typically, yes. Each tribe in central Gaul had painted pottery, but with a different style.
We can picture Gaul as a mosaic of tribes fast developing into fledgling states.
So what does Bibracte tell us about the Celtic world?
Well, very simply, that Bibracte was a proper town. So that means these Iron Age societies had turned just to become an urban civilization and to create proper towns with thousands of inhabitants, with quarters, with public activity, with residential quarters, and so on. I would say that the Gauls had a civilization which was as complex as the Roman one at the same time.
The Adwi were a powerful tribe, but a showdown with the expanding Roman Empire was becoming inevitable.
So Vincent, how far up are we?
820 meters over sea level. You can imagine that Rome is just somewhere, in the fog in the distance, not so distant from here.
How much the Gauls shared a common Celtic identity would be tested by a Roman invasion. It was in Bibracte that Vercingetorix was proclaimed head of a loose confederation of tribes in an attempt to unite against Julius Caesar's legions. The Gauls would not face the Roman army in open battle. Instead, they adopted hit-and-run tactics. After 6 years of skirmishing, Vercingetorix made the mistake of regrouping his forces at the hill fort at Alesia. It was here Caesar would finally confront these Celtic tribes in 52 BC. Today, all that's left of Alesia are the ruins of the later Roman town. Yet the site still reveals something of what the victor felt about the vanquished. This is a bronze figure made by the Romans and discovered here at Alesia in 1907. It's a dying Celt made of bronze. And I think images like this show the power not only of the Romans over the Celts, but the Celts over the Roman imagination. This is an image of a noble savage, despised at one level and admired on another.
Alesia is the place of a turning point of the European history. On this place, in the autumn precisely of 52 BC, the Roman armies of Julius Caesar defeated the Gauls.
Merci, t'arrives juste enlever la main, s'il te plaît.
It is a compliment to the Gauls that Caesar chose to lay siege to Alesia rather than face them in open battle. He began by building 15 miles of ditches.
So Vercingetorix was trapped on this site, which was a hilltop, with tens of thousands of his troops with him, and the Roman troops completely made a circle, a fortification all around the hill, on the edge of the hills behind us.
Vercingetorix called for reinforcements, but Caesar built a second line of defense to guard against a Celtic counterattack.
So we are dealing with 15 miles of ditches with something like 23 Roman forts, with tens of thousands of Roman soldiers everywhere watching Vercingetorix of his troops.
The showdown finally came when up to 250,000 Gauls rallied to aid their tribal cousins. But the Celtic temperament was broken by Roman discipline, and Vercingetorix would be starved to submission in Alesia.
The Romans had to wait till these people were starving and they had run out of water and food. And at the time, they just surrendered and gave Vercingetorix to the Roman general.
After centuries of tribal independence, Vercingetorix had tried to unite the Gauls against a common enemy, but it was too little, too late.
Was this a tragic day for the Celts?
It was definitely a tragic day for all the tribes which were involved in this battle. If we consider that these people were all Celts, it was certainly a very important day for all these people.
And if there'd been a different outcome, do you think we'd have a different Europe today?
I think it's very clear from our modern point of view that history would have turned to a completely different story if this battle hadn't taken place.
If the Gauls had won, who knows what a Celtic Europe would have looked like? 2,000 years on, the romantic myth of what might have been still has a powerful hold over the French nation. Military monuments are nothing unusual, but this statue's different because Vercingetorix lost. It's here because it's become a symbol of the French nation. And the first person to articulate this idea about Vercingetorix was the very man who defeated him, Julius Caesar. He said that if all the Gaulish tribes could unite, they could defy the universe. Quite a thought, especially if you're a Frenchman. The expanding Roman Empire had crushed the Celts in continental Europe. Within a few generations, all traces of their language, art and culture had disappeared. Or had they? Today in Ireland and Scotland, many people are convinced that they're the descendants of this race of ancient Celts, the last remnants of an ethnic group pushed to the margins of Europe as the Romans advanced. But does the evidence support this? My first problem is the Romans never called the people of Britain Celts, although they did say that the ancient Britons spoke a similar language to the Celts of Gaul. Perhaps the answer is in the most recognisable feature of Celtic culture, its distinctive art style. Could migrants to Britain have brought their art with them? The first clue is in the most unlikely place, Battersea, just by the power station. In 1857, a remarkable treasure was dredged up from the River Thames, a beautifully decorated bronze shield. And just downriver at Waterloo, another object was discovered, an extraordinary horned helmet. Because both were found in water and their exotic decoration was similar to the Celtic objects uncovered that same year at La Tène in Switzerland, Victorian archaeologists quickly put two and two together. They deduced that Celtic tribes must have migrated to Britain from Europe, bringing their art with them.
Well, here, Richard, is the Battersea Shield, and I'm holding the Waterloo helmet. These objects are renowned throughout the world for being classic Celtic objects.
So it's a really stunning piece of work, isn't it?
It's a stunning piece of work. It's also an incredibly complicated piece of work.
What was it about this type of art that was so important?
It becomes an international language, so associated with people of prestige, which spread across the whole of Europe amongst the elites.
These amazing objects look the business, but they aren't quite what they seem.
We call this a helmet, we call this a shield, but neither of these would ever have been used in battle. The shield is essentially a showpiece, it's a decorative object, and this isn't really a helmet, it's probably a piece of ceremonial headgear. And of course the point about this is that it's held on your head like a party hat.
Makes me feel like going to a party.
Beyond any doubt, these objects are masterpieces of Celtic art. But archaeologists today are less convinced by the Victorian idea that they came to Britain with Celtic migrants from the continent. In fact, some people seem to have a bit of a problem with the C word.
Do you think these objects were made by people who were Celts?
They're made by people we would call Celts today. Whether or not they would understand the word Celt is a different matter. Certainly, they've got Celtic art on them, but what's, I think, important to recognise is that these are very British objects. The style of Celtic art, the style of the decoration, it shares something with other parts of Europe, but it's also, at the same time, distinctly British.
The helmet and shield are Celtic in style, but they weren't brought by migrating Celts. In fact, some of the finest examples of what we call Celtic art today were not imported. They were all made in Britain.
This is the Snettisham Great Talk, and is one of the most astonishing pieces of prehistoric metalwork anywhere from Europe.
These objects prove that the art style of the continental Celts was well known in Britain and adapted to local tastes. What the objects don't prove is that either they themselves or the people that made and used them had arrived from mainland Europe. The art alone simply isn't proof that Celtic tribes moved here. To establish that, I need a different kind of evidence. In Yorkshire, there may be just what I'm looking for at a place called Wetwang. In 1984, in a gravel pit, a digger uncovered the first of a series of intriguing finds that hint at the presence of Celtic immigrants, people buried with chariots.
This is the valley in the Wolds which has produced more chariots than virtually anywhere else, because out of the something like 15 chariot burials that have been uncovered over the last 200 years, all but 2 of them have been found on the Yorkshire Wolds.
That's strange, isn't it?
Very strange.
Burying your dead with a chariot is practically unknown in Britain, but it was an old tradition among some Celtic tribes in Europe, just like the 4-wheeled wagon burial in Hochdorf, Germany.
This is the site.
Here?
Yeah, this is where it happened.
13 chariots have been discovered in this Yorkshire Valley alone. In 1984, 3 were found in a row.
At this end there was a young bloke with his chariot and his sword and a shield. In the middle, the woman, and then beyond her, the second man. Now, the woman's grave was the best preserved. She was lying on one side. It looked like somebody had fallen off a bicycle and just decayed.
So we often think about Boudica as riding around in a chariot, and we think about war. Was that what the chariots were for, or were they for other things as well?
You could have used them for anything you like, and when there wasn't a war on, you presumably wouldn't have left it in the shed.
Buried along with this woman and her chariot was a collection of extraordinary personal items, a mirror, horse harnesses, and all her finery decorated in the familiar Celtic style. Like the Battersea shield, her grave goods were all made in Britain, as was the chariot itself. Now, using the fragments of evidence, the wet-wang chariot has been brought back to life. So it's nice to see it, isn't it, in its full glory, like it would have been?
It's wonderful, yes. See, in the grave, you can see the rectangular shape where this has been. But that's all. It's like a sort of ghost of a chariot.
Chariots like this were widespread in Britain. They were used for war and transport. But chariot burials were unique. Is this proof that a warrior tribe of Celtic settlers came over from Europe, bringing their foreign traditions with them?
It does suggest that the ideas have come across from the continent, because we know that many of the parallels here are also to be found in parts of Central and Western Europe.
Steady, steady. The most intriguing clue is that the Romans called this local tribe Parisi, and a European tribe, also called Parisi, would give Paris its name. Both tribes buried their dead with chariots. Were they the same people?
I think there must have been some kind of connection. What it actually was, whether the people had come here from, or any of them had come here from the continent.
But would
you
say
say
they're Celts?
I wouldn't say they were Celts. I think that I don't tend to use the term. So-called Celts, if you want to.
Both the wet-wang chariots and the treasures dredged up from the Thames prove that Britons had connections with continental Celts. Some may have settled in southern England and Yorkshire, but there isn't evidence in England to prove that Celts came in sufficient numbers to drive out the local population.